Welcome, dear listener, to a journey not through the grand halls of kings, but through the hushed corridors and candle-lit chambers where the fate of nations was truly decided. In our story today, we pull back the velvet curtain on the medieval world. We are conditioned to picture history as a tapestry of crowned heads and battlefield glory, of Richard the Lionheart, of majestic cathedrals, of chivalrous knights. But beneath this familiar pageantry lay a hidden scaffolding of power. The king was often a symbol, a figurehead, while the real day-to-day work of running a kingdom fell to a select few who operated just beyond the public eye. These were the secret councils, the privy chambers, the gray eminences who whispered in the ears of monarchs and held the quill that wrote law into being. Over the next hour, we will explore the hidden mechanics of power in medieval Europe. We will venture into the vaulted chambers of the English Exchequer, the intimate closets of French kings, the secret tribunals of Westphalia, and the assassin mountains of Persia. We will meet the technocrats, the enforcers, and the shadowy figures who mastered the arts of finance, information, and secrecy. This is a story of how personal trust evolved into bureaucratic machinery, and how the quest for control gave birth to the very notion of the modern state. Settle in, and let us begin. To understand the secret council, we must first understand the paradox of medieval kingship. The medieval king had what scholars later termed two bodies. He had a physical, mortal body, prone to illness, poor judgment, and death, but he also possessed a political body, a symbolic, eternal embodiment of the realm itself. This political body demanded spectacle. The king had to be seen, processing through London or Paris, presiding over great feasts, touching for the king's evil to cure scrofula, and leading his knights into battle. This was the performance of power, a crucial ritual that reminded the realm of its cohesion under his divinely ordained rule. As historian Eliza Hartrick notes, this form of popular control involved the public witnessing the rituals of governance, holding the king and his officers accountable through collective sight. The king was on stage, and his subjects were the audience. However, the practical, mortal body of the king had to actually govern. He had to extract taxes, negotiate with fractious nobles, correspond with foreign powers, and dispense justice. These were not tasks suited for the grand hall. They were messy, complex, and often required discretion. A king could not publicly deliberate over whether to raise a hated tax or which noble conspiracy needed to be quietly crushed. This is where the secret council was born. It was the king's solution to the problem of governance. From the early Middle Ages, monarchs relied on their familia, the household staff who attended to their personal needs. The chamberlain who helped the king dress had unparalleled access. The steward who managed the household controlled the flow of people and resources. These were the king's servants, but because they were always there, they became his most trusted advisors. By the 13th and 14th centuries, as the business of government exploded in complexity, these informal household roles began to formalize. Kings needed men with specific skills, lawyers who understood the complexities of Roman and canon law, clerks who could draft complex diplomatic letters, and financiers who could manage the new monetary economy. These men were often of humble birth, university-trained clerics or minor knights, making them entirely dependent on the king's favor. They were perfect confidants, as they had no independent power base of their own to challenge the throne. This was the genesis of the secret council, from the French privé, meaning private or intimate. It was the king's private meeting, distinct from the large, unwieldy, and formal curia regis, or royal court, which included all the great barons who had a right by blood to advise the king. In his private chamber, the king could speak freely with his hand-picked advisors, free from the prying eyes and political agendas of the powerful nobility. If the secret council was the brain, its arms were the great institutions of state that it oversaw, the Chancery and the Exchequer. These were not secret, but their inner workings were opaque to the average subject, managed by a class of men who held the keys to the kingdom's survival, information and money. First, let us consider the Chancery. In an age before printing presses and mass communication, the written word was a source of immense power. The king's will was expressed through charters, writs, and letters. The Chancery was the factory that produced these documents. At its head was the chancellor, almost always a high-ranking churchman. He was the keeper of the Great Seal, the ultimate symbol of authenticity. Without the Great Seal, a royal command was just a piece of parchment. But the Chancery was more than just a typing pool. It was the king's memory. The clerks of the Chancery enrolled copies of every significant document sent out, creating massive volumes, the charter rolls, the patent rolls, the close rolls, which form the backbone of English medieval history today. This archive was a repository of precedent and right. When a king needed to prove his authority over a rebellious town or claim a traditional tax, his council would send a clerk to the archives to dig out the relevant charter. As Ron Macleff's research on Flanders shows, the ability to control and mobilize archives was a crucial component of sovereignty. By the 15th century, Flemish counts were not just issuing charters, they were confiscating them from rebellious towns, centralizing the truth of the realm in their own treasuries. The secret council knew that the past could be wielded as a weapon to control the present. Then there was the Exchequer, the engine of royal finance. Emerging in 12th century England, it was named for the checkered tablecloth on which accounts were calculated, like a giant abacus. Here, the sheriffs of every county came twice a year to render account for the taxes and fines they had collected. The Exchequer was a terrifyingly efficient machine. Its officials, the barons of the Exchequer, were relentless auditors. They did not care for chivalry or noble birth. They cared for pennies and shillings. The pipe rolls, the annual records of the Exchequer, are a testament to this relentless scrutiny. They show in minute detail the financial state of the realm. As the Cambridge History of Chivalry points out, this administrative structure, the Exchequer as a great administrative gyroscope, was the foundation upon which the military ambitions of kings like Richard I and his successors were built. These institutions created a new kind of power player, the technician of power, a term explored by the Gremia Research Project. These men were not warriors, they were experts. They knew the law, they knew finance, they knew how to write a letter that could start or prevent a war. They were the gray eminences who worked behind the curtain. They managed the flow of patronage, rewarding loyal followers with offices and land, and in doing so, built their own networks of influence that could rival those of the greatest dukes. The secret council became the meeting point where these technocrats, the chancellor, the treasurer, the senior judges, briefed the king and translated his will into actionable policy. Secrecy was not merely a preference in medieval government, it was a fundamental principle. Daniel Jute famously characterized the early modern period as the age of secrecy, but its roots lie deep in the medieval soil. To govern effectively, a king and his council had to operate within a bubble of confidentiality. If news of a planned tax, a diplomatic slight, or a military campaign leaked, it could spark rebellion, invite foreign aggression, or doom an expedition before it began. The secret councils, known by various names across Europe, the Conseil Secret in France, the Geheime Rate in the German principalities, the Consiglio Segreto in Italian city-states, functioned as the central nervous system for state secrets. Their primary tools were information and communication. Consider the life of a royal counselor in the 14th century. His day would be filled with reading intelligence reports. Spies were not an invention of the Cold War. Medieval kings maintained networks of informants in foreign courts and in the households of their own rebellious nobles. Merchants who traveled freely were often the best source of news. The council would receive letters from ambassadors, reports from border officials, and petitions from subjects. Their job was to sift through this mountain of information, separate truth from rumor, and present a distilled summary to the king. Communication was an art of discretion. Letters containing sensitive information were often sent in cipher. A simple substitution cipher, replacing letters with symbols, could baffle all but the most determined interceptor. More important than the letter itself was the messenger. Kings and councils trusted their messages to household knights or trusted clerks, men who could be relied upon to memorize a sensitive message rather than commit it to paper or to swallow a letter if captured. The council also managed the king's public image. When a decision was made in secret, it was the council's job to announce it in a way that seemed inevitable and just. They were the masters of framing. A tax wasn't a greedy king fleecing his people, it was a necessary aid to defend the realm against a dire threat. A noble's execution wasn't a political purge, it was the just punishment for a traitor revealed by God. But this culture of secrecy also created a fundamental tension. As the 2024 workshop on secret councils highlighted, there was a constant tension between formality and informality. The council itself was an institution, but its power often relied on personal, informal relationships. A counselor had influence not because of his title, but because of his proximity to and trust with the king. This personal nature of power meant that the death of a king could be catastrophic for a counselor, who might find himself cast out or even executed by the new regime. While the royal councils of England and France operated in the quiet rooms of palaces, a different, far more sinister form of secret power emerged in the heart of Germany, the Vehmgericht, or the secret tribunals of Westphalia. To understand the Vehmic courts, as they are sometimes called, we must imagine the Holy Roman Empire in the late Middle Ages. It was a patchwork of hundreds of semi-independent states, prince-bishoprics, free imperial cities, and knightly domains. The emperor was weak, and central authority was almost non-existent. Law and order were local, and feuds were a common way for nobles to settle disputes. It was in this environment, primarily in Westphalia, that the secret tribunals rose to prominence. These were not courts established by a king, but courts that claimed a lost imperial authority. They were free courts, but their proceedings were shrouded in absolute secrecy. Their members were known as the Wissenden, the knowing ones. Membership in this secret society was a serious affair. It was open to men of good standing, freeborn, and of honest reputation. When a man was initiated, he was given a secret password and a sign by which he could recognize another member. He swore a terrible oath to uphold the laws of the court, to bring any accusations he knew of to its attention, and, most chillingly, to carry out the court's judgments, even against his own father or brother, without question. To betray the secrets of the court was to invite death. The tribunals met in secret places, often at night in remote clearings, caves, or secluded corners of castles. The judge or stool-herr would preside. The proceedings were swift and ruthless. If the accused was a member, he could clear himself by oath, supported by oath helpers. But if he was not a member, he had little defense. The court relied on secret accusers and secret witnesses whose identities were never revealed. The ultimate power of the Vehmic court was its sentence. If the accused was found guilty, or if he failed to appear, the court would pronounce a sentence of death. This sentence was not carried out by a public executioner. Instead, it was whispered to the nearest Wissenden. Any knowing one who encountered the condemned was honor-bound to execute him on the spot, using the method dictated by the court, often hanging. The body would be left with a knife thrust into the ground nearby, the symbol that the execution was a judgment of the holy Vehm. Leaving the forests of Germany, our journey now takes us to the rugged mountains of Persia and Syria, to one of the most infamous and misunderstood secret societies in history, the Assassins, or more properly, the Nizari Ismailis. In the late 11th century, a charismatic and brilliant leader named Hassan Isaba seized the mountain fortress of Alamut. From this eagle's nest, he founded a state that was unlike any other. It was not a state of armies and borders, but a state of ideas, faith, and systematic political violence. It was a state built on secrecy. Hassan's followers were a minority sect within Shia Islam, facing annihilation by the dominant Seljuk Empire. Unable to meet the Seljuk Turks in open battle, Hassan devised a new strategy: strategic, targeted killing of enemy commanders and political leaders. The instrument of this policy was the Fidai, the self-sacrificing agent. The popular image of the assassins, fueled by Marco Polo's later accounts, is of young men drugged with hashish and led to a secret paradise garden, promised eternal bliss if they died in their mission. This is likely a colorful myth. The origin of the name assassin is disputed, possibly deriving from Asasiyun, meaning the people of the foundation, of the faith. But the myth speaks to the profound psychological power the Nizaris wielded. The training of a Fidai was a masterpiece of psychological conditioning. They were indoctrinated with absolute loyalty to the Grand Master, Hassan Isaba. They were trained in languages, in disguises, in the customs of the enemy. They learned to blend in, to wait patiently for months or even years for the perfect moment to strike. Their weapon was almost always a dagger, for it was intimate and certain. They did not use poison, seeing it as a woman's weapon. They wanted their act to be a public spectacle of defiance. When a Fidai struck, he did so in broad daylight, often in a mosque or a court, surrounded by the victim's bodyguards. He knew he would be cut down immediately. The act was a form of communication. It sent a message across the Islamic world: no one is safe. The assassins killed a few key figures, a vizier here, a governor there, and in doing so, they created an aura of terror that was far more effective than any army. The rulers of the day began to wear chainmail under their clothes, living in constant fear. The Nizari state was a secret council made manifest. Its leadership at Alamut was a small, intensely secretive group of religious and military strategists who controlled a network of agents spread across a continent. They demonstrated that power in the Middle Ages did not solely reside in land or men-at-arms. It could reside in information, in discipline, and in the terrifying ability to strike from the shadows. We have spoken of institutions and movements, but history is ultimately made by individuals. Let us now turn our attention to the specific type of person that thrived in this world of secret power, the Gray Eminence. The term itself comes from a later period, referring to Father Joseph, the Capuchin friar who was the hidden hand behind Cardinal Richelieu. But the archetype is timeless. In the medieval context, a gray eminence was a figure whose power and influence far exceeded their formal rank or title. They were the second in command, the power broker, the king's man of business. They were the ones who made the machine work. What were their characteristics? First, they were almost always social climbers. True power in the medieval court was inherited, but the influence to wield that power often came from below. These men rose through talent. They might be the sons of minor knights, burghers, or even peasants, but they possessed a sharp legal mind or a knack for finance that made them indispensable. Second, they were technicians of power.
Caspar Schlick, who rose to become the imperial chancellor to 3 successive Holy Roman emperors, Sigismund, Albert I, and Frederick III, was such a figure. He began as a simple notary, but became the leading diplomat of the empire, negotiating with Hussites, Poles, and the Pope. His power came not from birth, but from his mastery of the diplomatic game and his unparalleled access to the imperial ear. Another archetype is the royal favorite or minister favorite. Figures like Hugh Despenser the Younger in 14th century England or Alvaro de Luna in 15th century Castile accumulated immense power and wealth because they were the king's closest companion. They controlled access to the king. No petition could get through, no office could be granted without their say-so. This made them fabulously rich and fabulously hated. Their power, however, was fragile, resting entirely on the king's personal affection. When the king died or turned against them, their fall was sudden and absolute. Both Despenser and de Luna were executed by their political enemies. These gray eminences built networks, what we would call patronage systems. They placed their relatives in key church positions, their clients in county sheriffdoms, and their allies on judicial benches. They were nodes in a vast web of obligation and reward that spanned the kingdom. A foreign prince seeking an alliance would not just write to the king. He would write to the king's favorite, sending costly gifts and flattering letters. The gray eminence was the gatekeeper, the man who could make things happen. He was the living embodiment of the secret council's power, the personification of the informal structures that ran alongside the formal hierarchies of the state.
But this power was never absolute. The secret council's monopoly on information and decision-making was constantly challenged from below. The people, the commons, were not passive sheep. They had their own forms of power, their own ways of holding their rulers accountable, a concept historians call popular control. This was not democracy in the modern sense. It was a form of indirect power based on witnessing and auditing. In the towns of late medieval England, for example, the civic elite, mayors, aldermen, and councillors were elected. But once elected, the community expected to see them perform their office. The key moments were the annual audits. On a set day, the outgoing officials would have to present their financial accounts to a common assembly of the citizens. The commons would gather in the guild hall to see the books opened, to hear the tallies read aloud, to watch as the town's money was accounted for, penny by penny. This act of collective witnessing was a powerful constraint on the elite. The knowledge that every expense, every gift, every payment would be scrutinized by the community limited their freedom to embezzle or act arbitrarily. The ritual itself was a form of power. It was a public performance of accountability. The mayor would have to stand before his neighbors and justify his stewardship. If the accounts were not in order, the community could refuse to approve them, could sue the officials, or could vote them out at the next election. This is what Eliza Hartrich's study of the town of Lynn reveals. The crux of political debate was often not about who held power, but about how that power was scrutinized. Was the town to be governed by discreet deliberation behind closed doors by a wise few, or was it to be subject to popular control of the broader community? This tension played out in kingdoms as well. The entire history of medieval parliaments, diets, and estates general is a history of the commons, the represented non-nobles, demanding to be let in on the secrets. They demanded that new taxes, which touched their property, could not be decided in the secret council alone. They demanded redress of grievances before they would grant supply. The king's secrecy was constantly under siege by the nobles and commons' demand for consent. This was the ultimate check on the secret council. It could plot and plan, but to implement its grand designs, especially to fund them, it had to eventually go public. It had to reveal enough of its hand to convince the political nation that the proposed course of action was necessary. The age of secrecy was always shadowed by the persistent demand for publicity, for accountability, for the right of the people to see, if not to speak. As the Middle Ages gave way to the early modern period, the secret council did not disappear. It evolved. It became the Privy Council in England, the Conseil d'État in France. The informal group of the king's friends became a formal institution of state. Yet the tension at its heart remained. Under powerful monarchs like Henry VIII or Louis XIV, the council was an instrument of the royal will. But under weak monarchs or during regencies, the council could become the true government, a body of powerful ministers making decisions collectively, with the monarch as a mere figurehead. By the 18th century in Britain, a new development occurred. The king, George I, who spoke little English, stopped attending cabinet meetings. The meetings of the king's most senior ministers continued without him, presided over by a principal minister, the prime minister. The cabinet system was born. It was the direct descendant of the medieval secret council, but with a crucial difference. The king was no longer in the room. The advisors had finally become the decision-makers. This was the culmination of a centuries-long process. The men who once whispered in the king's ear had gradually taken the seat at the head of the table. The secret council had transformed into the cabinet, and while its meetings remain secret to this day, its decisions are the foundation of modern democratic government.
And so, dear listener, we come to the end of our journey through the hidden corridors of medieval power. We have seen that the glittering image of the king on his throne was only half the story. Behind the throne, in the quiet rooms, the real business of governing was conducted by a select few: the counselors, the clerks, the financiers, the enforcers. From the technocrats of the exchequer tallying their sums, to the gray eminences building their networks of patronage, from the grim judges of the Westphalian tribunals pronouncing death sentences in the night, to the fearless fidei of Alamut waiting with a dagger in the shadows, all were part of a hidden world where secrets were currency and information was power. These secret councils were not merely medieval curiosities. They are the ancestors of the committees, the cabinets, the intelligence agencies, and the advisors who run our world today. We may live in an age of social media and transparency, but the fundamental reality of power remains. The most important decisions are still made in private by a few, far from the public eye. Understanding the medieval secret council is understanding the DNA of power itself. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into history. If you enjoyed this journey, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What other hidden histories would you like to explore? Until next time, look closely at the world around you, for the most important things are often happening just out of sight.